My entire life had been planned around one simple expectation: I would marry the perfect Omega. Not just any Omega, either. My family wanted someone young, beautiful, untouched, and unclaimed, someone who would know her place beside the future head of the Kingsley family, obey me without hesitation, and never challenge my decisions. That was the kind of partner everyone expected me to choose. But instead, I was sitting on the couch with my 7-month pregnant Omega curled beside me. An Omega 2 years older than me. An Omega who had once been my ex's stepfather. The man my family would have considered the most unsuitable person in the world for their precious heir. And yet, somehow, he had become the one person I couldn't imagine living without. I had broken every expectation placed on me for him. And as I looked at the gentle curve of his 7-month belly, carrying my child, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what the Kingsleys wanted. I had chosen him. And I didn't regret it, not even for a second. This version has been edited to comply with YouTube community guidelines. For the full, uncut audiobook, you can listen to the complete version on my Patreon. The Patreon link is available in the description. Thank you so much for watching. 7 years ago, I was 20 years old, the only heir to the Kingsley family, and completely in love with a woman named Susan Whitmore. Susan was the daughter of Richard Whitmore, one of the country's most influential billionaires. At the time, I thought she was the center of my world. So when she invited me to spend a week on her father's private yacht while their family traveled along the coast, I didn't hesitate. I went because I loved Susan. And because I didn't want to waste 7 precious days away from her. Looking back, I realized that was the beginning of everything. Richard Whitmore had always been unusually friendly toward me. He would invite me to family dinners, ask me to visit their estate, and repeatedly encourage me to come along on their trips. I knew exactly why. I was Ethan Kingsley, the future head of the Kingsley family. Richard wasn't being kind out of pure affection. He knew our family's connection could benefit him, and he wanted to turn my relationship with Susan into something profitable. I knew it. But I was 20, arrogant, and desperately in love. So I ignored it. Until the day I saw Adrian. I walked into one of the yacht's lounges and found Richard standing there with a young Omega. His name was Adrian. He looked far too fragile for the environment he was trapped in. He was beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. He stood quietly near Richard, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the floor while everyone around him laughed and talked. Richard treated him like he was nothing more than an object he owned. And the worst part? Susan did the same. She would make cruel comments about Adrian, laugh when her father humiliated him, and sometimes deliberately provoke him just to watch him become uncomfortable. Adrian never fought back. He simply lowered his eyes. I noticed everything. But I did nothing. At 20, I convinced myself that Adrian was old enough to make his own decisions. If he hated the way Richard treated him, he could leave. At least, that's what I told myself. Then came the nights. My room was right beside Richard's suite. One night, I woke to the sound of someone crying. It was Adrian. His voice was muffled through the walls, trembling as he repeatedly begged Richard to stop and give him mercy. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to understand why no one was doing anything. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Every time, I heard him crying. Every time, I felt uncomfortable. But I still stayed silent. When I finally mentioned it to Susan, she only smiled. "That's just Dad," she said casually. "He's stronger than everyone else. Adrian just struggled to deal with him." I couldn't understand how she could say it so easily. The next morning, I understood even less. Adrian walked out of Richard's room wearing clothes that covered nearly his entire body. He moved carefully, as though even walking hurt. There were fresh marks on his skin. Small wounds. Bruises. Things that hadn't been there the day before. And while everyone went about their morning as if nothing had happened, Adrian quietly adjusted his clothes, making sure not even an inch of his skin was exposed. Maybe he was hiding the evidence. Maybe he was simply ashamed. I didn't know. I only knew that something was terribly wrong. Still, I never approached him. Not until our last day on the yacht. That afternoon, I found Adrian sitting alone outside, staring at the ocean. For once, there was no Richard. No Susan. No one telling him what to do. I don't know why, but I sat beside him. "You like the ocean?" I asked. He looked at me, surprised. Then he smiled faintly. "Very much." That was how our first real conversation began. We talked about music. Then movies. Then food. Then our favorite places. We talked about ridiculous things and serious things, and somehow, hours passed without either of us noticing. And the more Adrian talked, the more I realized how wrong I had been about him. He wasn't weak. He wasn't helpless. He wasn't the quiet, broken Omega everyone seemed to believe he was. He was intelligent. funny, gentle. He had dreams. He had opinions. He had a surprisingly stubborn side that made me laugh more than once. He had simply learned to hide all of that because nobody around him allowed him to be himself. That evening, I finally understood something I should have noticed from the beginning. Adrian wasn't being treated like a person. He was being used. And somehow, despite everything that had been done to him, he had remained kind. When I returned home the next day, I thought I would eventually forget him. I was wrong. Because 7 years later, I would be sitting beside that same Omega. Only this time, Adrian wouldn't be someone else's possession. He would be my husband. My 7-month pregnant Omega. And the man I had chosen over every expectation my family had ever placed on me. The man who had once been my ex-girlfriend's stepfather. The man I should never have fallen for. And yet, I would choose him all over again. The second time I saw Adrian was at Richard Whitmore's 50th birthday. By then, several months had passed since the yacht trip. I had almost convinced myself that the strange sadness in Adrian's eyes was something I had imagined. Then I saw him again. He was standing beside Richard in the middle of the ballroom, dressed in an expensive black suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. His face was covered with makeup. Too much makeup. The kind that wasn't meant to make someone look beautiful, but to hide something underneath. I knew exactly what Richard was trying to cover. The scars. The bruises. The evidence of what happened behind closed doors. But the makeup couldn't hide Adrian's eyes. If anything, they looked sadder than they had on the yacht. I tried not to stare. I genuinely did. But I couldn't stop looking at him. Every few minutes, my eyes found him again. And then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Whenever Richard touched him, Adrian flinched. A hand on his shoulder. A touch to his arm. Even when Richard casually placed a hand around his waist for the photographs. Adrian's body would tense for the briefest moment before he forced himself to relax. Nobody else seemed to notice. But I did. And for reasons I couldn't explain, seeing it hurt. Later that evening, Susan was busy dancing with her father while the guests surrounded them. I found Adrian alone near the terrace. Just like the last time. I walked toward him. He looked at me and gave me that same small, cautious smile. We started talking. At first, it was easy. We talked about the music playing inside, about the guest. But there was something different about me that night. I couldn't pretend anymore. Eventually, I looked at him and asked directly, "Why are you still with Richard?" Adrian went completely still. I continued before he could avoid the question. "I know what he's doing to you." His eyes dropped immediately. "I've heard you crying. I've seen the marks on you. I've seen you flinch whenever he touches you." My voice became quieter. "So why are you still with him?" For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he whispered, "Richard is my husband." I stared at him. He has the right to get angry with me sometimes. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sometimes? A bitter laugh escaped me. "Adrian, that's what you're calling this?" He remained silent. I was angry, not only at Richard, but at Adrian for accepting it. At 21, I was arrogant enough to believe that anyone could simply walk away from a terrible situation if they wanted to. So I said the words that would stay with me for years. "I can't help someone who doesn't want to help himself." Adrian finally looked at me. There was no anger in his expression. Only sadness. I took out my phone and gave him my number. "If you ever decide you're ready to leave, call me." He stared at the number on the screen. "I'll help you," I told him. "I'll help you get through everything. But you have to leave him first." I turned away. Then his quiet voice stopped me. "I don't have any way out." I looked back. He wasn't looking at me. Then he whispered, "But you do." I froze. For a moment, I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to turn around, sit beside him, and make him explain those words. But somehow, I already understood. He wasn't talking about his own escape. He was talking about mine. About Susan. About the relationship I had spent years believing was real. I left without asking. But I couldn't forget those words. And after that night, I began watching Susan more carefully. For the first time, I questioned things I had previously ignored. The strange conversations between her and Richard. The way they always seemed to know things about my family's business. The questions Richard asked about my father's investments and connections. The way Susan seemed far more interested in my family's future than she was in mine. I became suspicious. So I quietly asked my people to keep an eye on her. I didn't tell Susan. I didn't tell Richard. And within 1 week, they brought me everything. The truth was worse than I expected. Susan and Richard had been planning this from the beginning. They wanted me in their family because I was a Kingsley. They wanted access to my family's influence, connections, business relationships, and power. My relationship with Susan had never simply been about love. It had been a business opportunity. And while Susan spent years telling me that I was the love of her life, she had been cheating on me behind my back. I sat there reading everything they had uncovered. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I couldn't believe how completely I had fallen for it. Susan had looked at me every day and made me believe I was her entire world. I had loved her so deeply that I had ignored every warning sign. And the person who had tried to open my eyes wasn't my family. It wasn't my friends. It wasn't even someone who wanted anything from me. It was Adrian. The Omega I had barely known. The man everyone treated like he was weak and powerless. The man I had once believed simply needed to be brave enough to save himself. But now I understood. Adrian had been trying to warn me while he was barely surviving himself. And suddenly, I was grateful for one thing above everything else. I was grateful that I had met him. A few days later, I went to the Whitmore mansion. The moment I stepped inside, Susan and Richard greeted me with the same smiles they had always worn. As if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't spent years lying to me. As if I hadn't uncovered every secret they had desperately tried to hide. I let them pretend for a few minutes. Then I looked at Susan. I know everything. Her smile vanished. I know about your affairs, Susan. Every single one of them. She immediately shook her head. No. That's not true. It's a lie, she insisted. Someone is trying to frame me. Richard stepped forward, trying to play the reasonable father. Ethan, calm down. Whatever you've heard, we can sit down and discuss it. I turned toward him. Shut up. The room fell silent. Susan's face twisted with anger. Who told you? Her eyes moved between us. Who told you all of this? Then her gaze suddenly stopped. Adrian. He was standing quietly in the corner of the room, his eyes lowered as usual. Susan's expression changed instantly. You. Adrian didn't move. You told him, didn't you? She rushed toward him. Look at me. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes. Did you tell Ethan about us? He remained silent. I saw you talking to him at Dad's birthday. Susan screamed. What did you tell him? Stop. I stepped between them. No one told me anything. Susan glared at me. Then how do you know? Because I investigated. But she wouldn't listen. She was too angry. Before I could stop her, she struck Adrian. His head turned with the impact, but he didn't fight back. I felt something inside me snap. Richard moved toward Adrian too. You ungrateful. Don't. I stepped directly in front of Adrian. My voice was cold enough to silence the room. Touch him again, and you'll have a problem with me. Richard stared at me. Then he laughed. A slow, ugly laugh. So she was right? I frowned. Right about what? You really are feeling sorry for him. I didn't hesitate. Yes. I turned toward Adrian. And I'm not leaving him here. I held out my hand. Adrian, come with me. He stared at my hand. He didn't move. Adrian. Still nothing. I walked closer. You don't have to stay here anymore. I'll take care of everything. His lips trembled. I can't leave my husband. My patience broke. Why? He said nothing. I'll protect you, I insisted. I'll help you. You don't have to be afraid anymore. His eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. Then make me understand. His voice was barely audible. You know what they'll do if I leave. I looked at him. And suddenly, I understood. He wasn't staying because he loved Richard. He was staying because he was terrified of what would happen if he tried to escape. But I couldn't leave him there. Not after everything I had learned. Richard suddenly laughed. He walked over and wrapped his arm tightly around Adrian, pulling him against his side. Look at this. His smile was full of contempt. Is Ethan Kingsley showing sympathy for my little toy? My jaw tightened. Richard continued. You think Adrian can just walk away? He looked directly at me. I paid $1 million for him. I stared at him. Richard's voice became colder. He's mine. Then he looked at Adrian. His only responsibility is to satisfy me. That's what I paid for. Adrian's face went pale. Richard's next words made everything fall into place. And after what he did, betraying us and interfering in my daughter's relationship, he'll have to pay for his mistake. I finally understood. Adrian wasn't refusing to leave because he didn't want freedom. He believed he had no freedom to begin with. Richard had made sure of that. But Richard had forgotten one thing. Adrian wasn't alone anymore. I stepped forward. Do you really believe you can keep him because you paid $1 million? Richard's expression hardened. I smiled. You've forgotten who I am. I was Ethan Kingsley, the future head of the Kingsley family. One of the most powerful and feared families in the country. I reached for Adrian's hand. This time, I didn't ask permission. Come with me. He looked frightened. Ethan. I tightened my grip around his hand. I'm not leaving you here. I started walking toward the door. Behind me, Richard began shouting. Susan joined him. They screamed that Adrian belonged to them. That I had no right to take him. I ignored every word. Before leaving, I turned around one last time. Richard. He stopped. You'll be receiving a check from me. His expression changed. The exact amount you claim you paid for Adrian. I looked at Adrian. Consider it the price of his freedom. Richard stared at me in disbelief. Then I turned toward Susan. And you? She looked at me. I'll make sure there's some extra money in that envelope for you too, sweetheart. I smiled coldly. A little donation from your ex. Susan's face turned red with fury. Adrian tried to stop me. Ethan, please. But I didn't listen. I pulled him out of the mansion with me. And as the doors closed behind us, I could still hear Susan and Richard screaming. They could scream all they wanted. Because their threats meant nothing. If the Kingsley heir wanted someone free, no one in that country was going to stop him. That same day, I sent Richard Whitmore a check for $10 million. It wasn't a payment for Adrian. It was my way of making sure Richard understood that whatever hold he thought he had over him was over. Adrian was free. I didn't take him to the Kingsley family mansion. Instead, I drove him to one of my private estates, a place I rarely visited and even fewer people knew about. It was hidden away in the middle of beautiful countryside, surrounded by trees, gardens, and endless greenery. I had built it as my own little escape from the pressure of being a Kingsley heir. There were no business meetings there. No family expectations. No strangers constantly watching me. Just peace. Adrian sat silently beside me throughout the entire drive. He didn't say a single word. His eyes remained fixed on the window, and every now and then, I caught him glancing nervously at me before quickly looking away. I knew he was scared. He had spent so long being controlled that even kindness probably felt suspicious to him. But I had no hidden intentions. I wasn't bringing Adrian with me because I wanted something from him. I wasn't expecting him to repay me. At that point, I didn't even have romantic feelings for him. I simply wanted to help him. And somewhere during that drive, I made myself a promise. No matter what it took, I would save the broken Omega sitting beside me. I would give him the life he had been denied for so long. When we finally reached the estate, I took him inside. My staff immediately came forward. I looked at them seriously. Adrian will be staying here. Everyone nodded. No one pressures him about anything. Don't question him about his past unless he chooses to talk about it. Give him whatever he needs, and most importantly, treat him with respect. Then I looked at Jack, one of my most trusted bodyguards. Jack, stay with him. Jack nodded immediately. Wherever Adrian goes, you go with him. Make sure he's safe. Adrian stood there silently, his eyes still fixed on the floor. I could tell he didn't know what to make of any of this. So I took him upstairs and showed him the guest room. It was directly beside my own suite. This is your room. Adrian slowly looked around. You can change anything you don't like. If you need something, ask for it. Clothes, books, food, anything. He remained quiet. Then he finally looked at me. His voice was barely audible. Why are you doing all this? I didn't answer immediately. He lowered his eyes again. I don't have anything to give you. There were tears gathering in his eyes. I looked at him for a moment before shaking my head. You don't owe me anything. He looked confused. I have more than enough, I continued. What I need is someone intelligent enough to help me manage some of my businesses. His eyes lifted slightly. I smiled. I've seen how intelligent you are, Adrian. He looked surprised. You understand business. You notice things other people miss. Richard may never have appreciated that, but I did. I paused. So when you're ready, I want you to work with me. He stared at me as though he couldn't understand why I would offer him something like that. You don't have to decide now. I stepped closer. But I want you to have something to look forward to. I wanted him to understand that his life wasn't over. It was finally beginning. From today onward, you don't have to worry about Richard. His eyes immediately filled with tears again. I'll handle him. I spoke slowly so there would be no misunderstanding. You don't have to fight him anymore. You don't have to hide. You don't have to spend another night wondering what he's going to do to you. Adrian's lips trembled. All I want from you right now is for you to get better. I gave him a small smile. You're a good person, Adrian. He looked away, trying to hide his tears. I don't want you to suffer anymore. I turned toward the door. And don't think of me as someone you owe. I looked back at him. Think of me as a friend. Someone who wanted nothing from him. Someone who simply wanted him to have a chance at a life he could call his own. For several seconds, Adrian said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. It was such a small gesture. But I knew it meant something. And as I walked out of his room, I believed that was all I wanted. To save him. To give him his freedom. To help him become the person he had been forced to hide for so many years. I had no idea that the Omega I had brought into my estate as someone I wanted to protect would eventually become the person I couldn't imagine living without. The next morning, I took Adrian to see my private physician, Dr. Lisa Morgan. Lisa was a beta and one of the few doctors I trusted completely. She was compassionate, discreet, and never treated people differently because of their status. The moment I told Adrian where we were going, I noticed the fear in his eyes. "I don't need a doctor," he whispered. "You do," I said gently. "You've been through too much. You need a proper checkup." His fingers tightened around the edge of his shirt. I could see that the idea of being examined frightened him. So I softened my voice. "Nothing is going to happen to you. Lisa is here to help you. And I'll stay right here." He looked at me for several seconds before finally nodding. When we arrived, Lisa greeted him warmly. She didn't rush him. She explained every part of the examination before doing anything, giving Adrian the chance to ask questions or tell her to stop. Even then, he remained tense. I could see how difficult it was for him to trust anyone. Eventually, Lisa asked me to wait outside while she examined him. I agreed immediately. I didn't want Adrian to feel as though he had to endure another person's presence simply because I had brought him there. Nearly an hour later, Lisa came out. At first, she gave me a reassuring smile. "His immediate physical condition is stable," she said. "With proper food, rest, medication where necessary, and regular medical care, he should recover physically." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That's good." But Lisa didn't leave. Her expression became more serious. "Ethan, there's something you need to know." I looked at her. "What is it?" She lowered her voice. "Adrian has suffered extensive abuse." My entire body went still. Lisa explained that his body showed evidence of repeated injuries, both old scars and newer wounds. Some areas had been subjected to particularly severe abuse. I felt my hands slowly curl into fists. But Lisa wasn't finished. "His physical injuries are only part of the problem." She looked directly at me. "He's showing significant signs of psychological trauma." I didn't speak. "He has been living in fear for a long time," she continued. "He's withdrawn, hypervigilant, and extremely uncomfortable with physical contact. His mind has learned to expect danger even when there isn't any." I looked toward the closed examination room door. Adrian was behind it. Alone. "Can he recover?" Lisa nodded. "Yes. But it will take time." "How much?" "There isn't a fixed answer." She sighed softly. "He needs stability. He needs professional psychological support. And most importantly, he needs to feel that he is finally in control of his own life." I nodded. "Whatever he needs, I'll provide it." Lisa gave me a serious look. "Then don't treat his recovery like something you can rush." "I won't. He may have good days and terrible days. He may suddenly become frightened over things that seem insignificant. He may struggle to trust you, even when you're trying to help him." I understood. "He doesn't owe me trust," I said quietly. Lisa smiled faintly. "Good." I looked through the small glass panel in the door. Adrian was sitting quietly on the examination bed, his hands folded together, his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked exhausted. And suddenly, memories came rushing back. The yacht. The crying behind Richard's door. The bruises. The way Adrian had always lowered his eyes. The way I had convinced myself that it wasn't my business. I had been wrong. I had been terribly wrong. I turned back toward Lisa. "I'll take care of him." She nodded. "I believe you." I looked at Adrian again. At that moment, I made myself another promise. I wasn't going to save him for a day, a week, or until the guilt disappeared. I would give him time. I would give him safety. And I would stay beside him until he finally understood something Richard had spent years trying to erase from his mind. Adrian wasn't broken beyond repair. He was a person who had been hurt. And people who had been hurt deserved the chance to heal. From that day on, I started taking care of Adrian in every way I could. But there was one thing I was always careful about. I never wanted him to feel like I saw him as weak. Adrian had spent years being controlled, spoken for, and treated as though he couldn't make a single decision for himself. The last thing I wanted was for my kindness to become another form of control. So I never treated him like something fragile. I simply made sure he knew he mattered. I didn't move into the private estate with him. It was supposed to be his safe place, somewhere he could breathe without the Kingsley name. But I visited constantly. Sometimes I would arrive before breakfast. Sometimes I would stay until midnight. And gradually, I started bringing my work into his life. At first, I gave him small tasks from the office, reports, proposals, financial documents. I wasn't expecting much. Then Adrian surprised me. He was brilliant. He could look through a complicated report and immediately notice something my executives had missed. His understanding of business was incredible, and the more I worked with him, the more I wondered how Richard had managed to overlook such an intelligent man for so many years. Soon, the work became something we shared. I'd sit across from him with my laptop while he worked through his own files. I'd tell him about my day. I'd complain about my executives. I'd tell him about the ridiculous meetings I'd been forced to sit through. And Adrian would listen. Sometimes he'd give me advice. Sometimes he'd laugh. Sometimes he'd simply shake his head and tell me I was being dramatic. I liked those moments. More than I should have. Eventually, I started bringing him to the office. I made sure everyone understood that Adrian wasn't there because he was someone I had rescued. He was there because he was intelligent, capable, and had earned his place. And I think that mattered to him. Of course, I still worried about him. I'd call him during the day just to ask, "Did you take your medicine?" He would immediately sigh. "Ethan, I remember. You forgot yesterday. That was one time. It was 3 times. He'd glare at me. And I'd laugh. Those little arguments were strangely comforting. They meant Adrian was beginning to feel safe enough to be annoyed with me. I also tried to introduce him to my friends. One evening, I asked him to come out with us. The moment I mentioned it, I noticed his hesitation. He didn't refuse. But I could tell he wasn't comfortable. So I didn't push. "It's okay," I told him. "We don't have to go." And I meant it. Instead, I took him somewhere quieter. The riverside became our place. There was something peaceful about sitting there with the sound of the water in the background. We didn't talk about Richard. We didn't talk about Susan. We didn't talk about the past unless Adrian brought it up. Most of the time, we talked about completely pointless things. Usually, we gossiped about people at the office. One employee was always late. Another was convinced he was the smartest person in the building. Someone else had an obsession with stealing snacks from the break room. Adrian would laugh at my stories. But what always surprised me was the way he talked about people. Even when we were gossiping, he rarely spoke cruelly about anyone. He'd find an excuse for them. "Maybe she's just nervous. He's actually nice. He's just awkward. She probably has a lot going on." After everything Adrian had endured, I couldn't understand how he still had so much kindness left inside him. Every time we went for a checkup, Lisa noticed his progress. "He is improving," she'd tell me. His physical health was getting better. His appetite had returned. He was sleeping more peacefully. He was becoming more confident. But she also reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line. There were still difficult days. Days when Adrian became distant without warning. Days when a sound, a smell, or a simple situation could make him tense. Sometimes I'd find him sitting quietly, his hands trembling. And every time I noticed, I'd go to him. I never demanded an explanation. I never asked him to talk. I would simply sit nearby. Sometimes I'd give him water. Sometimes I'd start talking about work. Sometimes I'd tell him something ridiculous just to distract him. And slowly, I'd watch the tension leave his body. His breathing would steady. His hands would stop shaking. And eventually, he'd look at me. I began noticing something I couldn't explain. Whenever Adrian was uncomfortable, I wanted to be the person who made him feel safe. Whenever he was sad, I wanted to make him smile. Whenever he laughed, I wanted to hear it again. At first, I told myself it was simply because I had promised to protect him. But eventually, that explanation stopped making sense. I was thinking about him when he wasn't around. Wondering whether he'd eaten. Wondering what he was doing. Wondering if he was having a good day. I started looking forward to our conversations. To our riverside evenings. To the way he would quietly correct me when I was being unreasonable. Somewhere along the way, Adrian had stopped being a responsibility. He had become someone I genuinely wanted in my life. And I think that was when everything began to change. Because without realizing it, I wasn't just protecting Adrian anymore. I was falling for him. Whatever I felt for Adrian had been growing quietly, almost without my noticing it. Then one afternoon, my father asked me about him. I was at the Kingsley mansion when he looked up from the documents on his desk and said casually, "So, how is Adrian doing?" I immediately looked at him. "Why?" My father leaned back in his chair. "I met Richard a few days ago. He told me about what happened." My expression hardened. "He told you I bought Adrian?" The anger in my voice was immediate. "I didn't buy him, Dad." I clenched my jaw. "I freed him. I told him what Richard had done. I told him about the abuse, the threats, and the way Adrian had been treated like property. Adrian is innocent," I said. "He never deserved any of that." My father gave me a small smile. "I know." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I know everything, Ethan." He folded his hands on the desk. I have people who keep me informed about what's happening around my family. I knew what Richard had been doing. And I knew what you were doing for Adrian. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or angry. Then my father smiled. And I'm proud of you. I looked at him. You did the right thing. For a moment, the tension in my chest eased. Then his expression changed. But there's something you need to know. I immediately became serious. Did Adrian ever tell you anything about his family? No. My father was quiet for a moment. Then you probably don't know who Adrian's father was. I shook my head. He was Richard's business partner. I listened. They had a falling out after Adrian's father tried to betray Richard. Richard discovered it and made him repay every loss. My father's voice became colder. But he couldn't repay everything. I already felt uneasy. He was still short by $1 million. My father looked directly at me. Richard offered him a solution. I knew I wasn't going to like what came next. He could erase the remaining debt if Adrian's father gave him his son. My blood ran cold. He agreed. Just like that. A father had handed over his 18-year-old son to settle a debt. I stared at my father in disbelief. Richard was 45 when he married Adrian. My hands curled into fists. Adrian was 18. Only a year older than Susan. He had barely become an adult when his own father traded him away. At first, Richard treated him well, my father continued. He wanted Adrian to believe he had a good life. But eventually, Richard wanted children. I remained silent. When Adrian couldn't give him one, Richard's behavior changed. The abuse became worse. I swallowed. Then my father said something that made my entire body go still. And eventually, Richard began using Adrian to secure business deals. I slowly looked up. He would offer Adrian to his business associates in exchange for contracts, favors, and connections. For a long time, I couldn't say anything. I thought about every time I'd seen Adrian standing beside Richard. Every time he'd flinched. Every time he'd covered his body. Every time he'd looked at the floor. And suddenly, those memories felt completely different. I had thought Richard was simply cruel. I hadn't realized how much of Adrian's life had been controlled by that man. Adrian hadn't simply been trapped in an abusive marriage. He had been treated as a commodity. Something Richard believed he had purchased. Something he could use whenever it benefited him. I finally managed to speak. How do you know all of this? My father smiled faintly. Ethan, I'm your father. If I want to know something, I find out. Then he leaned forward. I'm not telling you to stop helping Adrian. He paused. But friendship is one thing. His voice became more serious. If you develop feelings for him, things could become complicated. I looked at him. I don't know what my future with Adrian will be. I admitted it honestly. I don't know if he'll always be my friend or if he'll become something more. Then I shook my head. But if it becomes more, I won't care what anyone thinks. My father's expression changed. Not even your family? Not even my family. I stood. Adrian has spent his entire life having other people decide what he should be, who he should belong to, and what he owes them. I looked directly at my father. I'm not going to do the same thing. Then I walked out. I didn't go to the office. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the estate. Straight to Adrian. Because after hearing the truth about his past, I couldn't bear the thought of him being alone. And somewhere during that drive, I finally admitted something to myself. I wasn't protecting Adrian anymore simply because I felt sorry for him. I wasn't helping him because of some promise I'd made. I cared about him. Deeply. And if those feelings eventually became something more, I already knew one thing. I wouldn't run from them. I had barely stepped inside when I saw Adrian. And before I could think about what I was doing, I walked over and pulled him into a hug. He froze for a second. Then I felt him slowly relax against me. I kissed his forehead. Are you okay? He looked up at me, clearly surprised by how emotional I seemed. I'm okay. Did you eat? A tiny smile appeared on his lips. Yes, Ethan. I ate. He studied my face. Something happened, didn't it? You look worried. I shook my head. Nothing happened. But I didn't let him go. I held him a little longer than usual. Then I kissed his forehead again. Adrian looked even more confused. Ethan. I still couldn't explain it. How could I tell him that I had just learned another piece of his past and suddenly felt an almost unbearable need to make sure he was safe? So I simply held him. For the first time, I didn't try to hide how much I cared. Adrian eventually stopped asking questions. He just stayed there quietly, his cheek against my shoulder. Neither of us realized it then, but something between us had shifted that night. After that, I started spending more time at the estate. I told myself it was because I wanted to make sure Adrian was doing well. But eventually, I stopped making excuses. I simply liked being there. I liked having breakfast with him. I liked hearing him complain about my terrible taste in movies. I liked listening to him talk about work. And, strangely enough, I even enjoyed fishing with him. Neither of us knew what we were doing. One afternoon, we spent almost an hour arguing over whose fault it was that we'd caught nothing. "You scared the fish away," Adrian accused me. "You're the one who dropped the bait." "I didn't." "You absolutely did." He laughed. I laughed too. And for a while, there was no past between us. No Richard. No Kingsley family. No expectations. Just two people sitting beside a river, enjoying each other's company. Sometimes, though, our conversations would suddenly become quiet. I'd look at Adrian. He'd look back at me. And neither of us would say anything. There was something in those moments. Something neither of us seemed ready to name. I'd look away first. Usually, so would he. Then we'd continue talking as though nothing had happened. I celebrated Adrian's 24th birthday a few weeks later. It was nothing extravagant. Just a small celebration at the estate with the staff. A cake. Some decorations. A nice dinner. But Adrian looked genuinely happy. He laughed when everyone sang for him. He even smiled when I gave him his gift. I remember watching him that evening and thinking that I wanted to see that expression on his face more often. Later that night, I found him on the balcony outside his room. We talked for a while. About the birthday. About the cake. About nothing important. Then we fell silent. Adrian looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us moved immediately. There was no plan. No decision. Just a moment that seemed to happen naturally. I stepped a little closer. He didn't move away. So I leaned in and kissed him. It was gentle. Almost hesitant. And when I pulled back, Adrian was staring at me with tears in his eyes. My heart dropped. "Adrian?" He shook his head and took a small step back. "No. What happened?" His voice trembled. "We shouldn't have done that." I stared at him. I thought, "I know." He wiped his tears. "But it's not right." "Why?" "Because we're making a mistake." He looked away. "You should leave." I wanted to ask him 100 questions. But I could see how frightened he was. So I didn't argue. I simply nodded and left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I regretted kissing him. I didn't. I was hurting because I knew Adrian had regretted allowing himself to want it. The next morning, he came to me. "I think I should leave the estate." I looked at him. "What?" "I'll find somewhere else to stay." He spoke quietly. "I'll still work for you. Nothing will change between us professionally. But I can't keep living here." I walked closer. "Why?" He didn't answer. "Adrian." He finally looked at me. And I said the one thing I'd been afraid to say. "You love me too." For a moment, he simply stared at me. Then he smiled sadly. "Yes." My heart stopped. But love isn't always enough. He looked down. "Our lives are too different." I shook my head. "I don't care." "You will." "Adrian. You are Ethan Kingsley." His voice cracked. "You're the heir to one of the most powerful families in the country." He swallowed. "And I'm someone Richard bought." My expression hardened. "Don't say that." "But it's true." "No. It is." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "If we stay together, people will talk. They'll say terrible things about you. They'll say you ruined your future for someone like me. I don't care what they say. But I do." He looked away. "I don't want to become another burden in your life." "You aren't a burden." "I am." He shook his head. "You don't understand what someone like me is supposed to be." I stepped closer. "Then tell me." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to be loved." His voice was barely a whisper. "People don't love me, Ethan. They use me." My heart broke. "You don't have to believe that anymore." He gave me a small, painful smile. "I want to." Then he looked down. "But I don't know how." I reached for him slowly. This time, I didn't pull him into my arms without knowing whether he wanted it. I simply held out my hand. After a moment, Adrian placed his hand in mine. And that tiny gesture told me everything. He was scared. He wanted to leave. But some part of him wanted to stay too. So I pulled him gently into a hug. He didn't resist. Instead, he buried his face against my chest. And then he started crying. Not the quiet tears I'd seen before. He cried like he had been holding everything inside for years. I held him tighter. I didn't tell him he had to love me. I didn't ask him to stay. I simply whispered, "You don't have to decide anything today." He continued crying against me. "You don't have to prove anything to me." I rested my hand gently against his back. "And you don't have to become someone else to deserve love." He didn't answer. But he didn't let go either. And for the first time, I understood that loving Adrian wasn't going to be about convincing him with grand promises. It was going to be about giving him enough time, patience, and safety to discover for himself that he was worthy of being loved. So I held him. And for that moment, that was enough. That entire day, I stayed close to Adrian. Not because I wanted to watch over him every second, but because I could tell he was still struggling with everything he had said that morning. I didn't want him alone with those thoughts. Whenever we walked through the estate together, I stayed beside him. Whenever I took his hand, I'd turn it over and press a soft kiss against his knuckles. You know you're worthy of love, don't you? Adrian would usually lower his eyes. Sometimes he'd give me a faint smile. Sometimes he wouldn't answer at all. So I'd tell him again. You deserve to be cared for. Another gentle kiss. You deserve kindness. You deserve a life where you don't have to be afraid. I wasn't trying to convince him with one speech. I wanted him to hear those words often enough that one day they would finally feel true. At dinner, I noticed he was barely eating. Adrian. I'm not hungry. You've barely touched anything. He gave me a small sigh. I'll eat later. I shook my head. Later never seems to come with you. He almost smiled. So I sat beside him and picked up his spoon. Just eat a little. He looked at me. Ethan, I can feed myself. I know. I smiled. Let me do it anyway. After a moment, he allowed me to feed him. It wasn't about him being incapable. It was simply one of those quiet moments where I wanted to take care of him, and he allowed me to. When he had eaten enough, I put the spoon down and took his hand. Give me some time. His eyes met mine. I know you don't believe everything I say yet. I gently squeezed his hand. But give me time, and I'll prove it. Prove what? That your life doesn't have to be like this anymore. His eyes became glossy. That you can be loved without owing anything in return. He looked away. And that you're safe with me. I didn't promise him that the world would suddenly become perfect. I promised him something simpler. That I would be there. That I would keep showing up. That I wouldn't disappear when things became difficult. That night, when we were getting ready to sleep, Adrian hesitated outside my room. I noticed immediately. You can stay if you want. He looked at me. Are you sure? Of course. He eventually stepped inside. I didn't pull him toward me. I simply opened my arms. After a moment, he came closer and rested his head against my chest. I wrapped my arms around him gently. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then I kissed his forehead. You're precious to me. His eyes closed. And nothing you went through changed that. I held him a little closer. You don't have to be afraid of losing me tonight. His breathing slowly became steadier. Eventually, he fell asleep against me. I stayed awake for a while, listening to his quiet breathing. For years, Adrian had lived as though love always came with a price. That night, I decided I would spend as long as necessary proving the opposite. He didn't know me his trust. He didn't know me his love. He didn't know me anything. I simply wanted him to wake up one day and realize that someone could stay beside him without asking for anything in return. So I held him through the night. And before I finally closed my eyes, I whispered one last thing against his hair. Give me time, Adrian. I'll prove to you that everything can be okay. As the days turned into weeks, Adrian and I grew closer without either of us really noticing when it happened. There was no single moment when everything changed. It was little things. He started sitting beside me without waiting to be invited. He stopped hesitating before taking my hand. And slowly, the distance he had always kept between us disappeared. I never pushed him. I wanted him to come closer because he wanted to, not because he was afraid of losing the life I'd given him. Then one evening, Adrian finally decided he was ready to tell me the whole truth. We were sitting together when he suddenly became quiet. Ethan, I need to tell you something. I turned toward him. He took a long breath. My father gave me to Richard. My heart tightened. I already knew. But I didn't interrupt him. I wanted him to tell me in his own words. He told me about his father's debt. How Richard had offered to erase the remaining money if Adrian was handed over to him. How his father had agreed. How Richard had married him when he was only 18. Then came the part Adrian struggled most to say. After a while, he started using me. His voice became quieter. For business. He explained how Richard would use him to impress clients and business partners, how he had turned Adrian into something that could be offered whenever a deal required it. I listened without interrupting. By the time Adrian finished, tears were running down his cheeks. I know you probably already know some of this. I do. He looked at me in surprise. My father told me. Adrian lowered his eyes. I was afraid you'd think differently about me after hearing it. I immediately reached for him. I don't. But how can you love someone with a past like mine? I leaned forward and kissed his forehead. Because your past isn't who you are. Another kiss. It doesn't change the person sitting in front of me. He closed his eyes. And what if loving me becomes too difficult? Then we'll take it slowly. I kissed his cheek. We don't have to solve our entire future tonight. He gave me a small, tearful smile. Then he hesitated. There is something else. I waited. Richard wanted a child. My expression changed slightly. But I didn't want one. He looked down. I knew what kind of life I was living. I couldn't bring a child into that. Then he quietly admitted that he had secretly taken medication to prevent pregnancy. I sat there silently for a moment. I had already accepted the possibility that Adrian and I might never have a biological child. I'd convinced myself that it didn't matter. If he was beside me, that would be enough. But hearing that he had prevented pregnancy because he had been terrified of bringing a child into Richard's world gave me a strange sense of relief. Not because of the pregnancy itself. Because for the first time, the future I'd secretly imagined didn't feel completely impossible. A child with Adrian. Someone who might inherit his gentle nature. His kindness. His quiet courage. I almost smiled at the thought. Then I reminded myself that our future belonged to both of us. Adrian had spent too much of his life having other people make decisions for him. So I simply pulled him closer. We'll decide everything about our future together. He looked at me. Together? Always. That was enough. A few weeks later, I took Adrian home to meet my parents. I expected questions. I expected resistance. Instead, my parents surprised me. They welcomed him. My mother hugged him as though she had known him for years. My father shook his hand and told him he was welcome in our family. I watched Adrian struggle to hold back tears. I knew what those words meant to him. For the first time, someone was welcoming him without asking what he could offer in return. Of course, my parents weren't the only people who mattered. There were plenty of others who weren't kind. People whispered about Adrian's past. Some questioned why the future head of the Kingsley family had chosen an older Omega who had already been married. Others suggested I should find someone more suitable. I ignored them. They didn't know Adrian. They didn't know how intelligent he was. They didn't know how kind he could be. They didn't know how much strength it had taken for him to survive everything he'd been through. And they certainly didn't get to decide who I loved. 2 years later, Adrian became my husband. Our wedding wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about Richard. It wasn't about the Kingsley family name. It was simply about two people choosing each other. When Adrian stood beside me that day, dressed for our wedding, I remembered the young man I'd met years earlier. The Omega who couldn't look anyone in the eyes. The man who believed he was nothing more than something someone else could own. Now he was standing beside me by choice. And when he reached for my hand, I held it tightly. I had once promised him that if he gave me time, I'd prove that everything could be okay. Years later, I realized I had kept that promise. Not by giving him a perfect life, but by giving him something he had never truly had before. A choice. And he chose me. After our marriage, Adrian surprised me one evening by telling me he wanted to have a child. I think I'm ready, he said quietly. I looked at him for a moment before smiling. I want a baby too. His face immediately brightened. But we don't have to rush. His smile faded slightly. Why? I took his hand and kissed his fingers. Because I want my baby to heal properly first. Adrian stared at me. I'm fine, Ethan. I know you feel fine. I smiled and kissed his forehead. But you've spent years surviving things no one should have had to survive. I want you to have time to simply enjoy being happy. He smiled at me. I'm really okay. I know. I pulled him closer. But I'm still not rushing. The truth was, I wanted a child with Adrian more than I could explain. But I wanted him healthy and happy first. During those months, I continued building a life with him. I gave Adrian an important position in my company. He had earned it through his intelligence and hard work, and I wanted him to have something that belonged entirely to him. Then, on his birthday, I surprised him with the keys to an estate. Adrian stared at them. Ethan, what's this? Your birthday present. But you already gave me a home. I know. Then why another one? Because I wanted you to have it. He shook his head with a helpless smile. You spoil me too much. I smiled. I haven't even started. It was the same estate where he had first begun rebuilding his life, except now it truly belonged to him. Adrian kept telling me that I didn't need to give him anything else. I ignored him. I simply loved seeing him happy. Then, one day, Adrian became sick. His fever started in the afternoon and kept rising. By evening, I was beside his bed with Lisa checking him. She examined him carefully and gave him medication. Then she looked at me. Ethan, you need to stay at another room. I frowned. I'm staying. You could catch the fever yourself. Adrian immediately agreed with her. Please go. I looked at him. Adrian. I'm fine. He gave me a weak smile. You have work tomorrow. I'll cancel it. You can't get sick because of me. Lisa nodded. He's right. You need to rest too. Reluctantly, I listened. I left the room. I even went downstairs. I tried to work. I tried to convince myself that Adrian was okay. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. After a while, I went back upstairs. And the moment I opened the door, I knew I'd made the wrong decision. Adrian was struggling in his sleep. His face was flushed from the fever. His breathing was uneven. And there were tears running silently down his cheeks. My heart broke. Adrian. He opened his eyes weakly. Ethan. That was enough. I sat beside him immediately. Hey. I'm here. He reached for me without thinking. I took his hand. I'm here. I gently wiped the tears from his face. You don't have to cry. He looked exhausted. I feel terrible. I know. I pressed a kiss to his forehead. Then his cheek. Then his temple. Anywhere I could kiss without disturbing him. I'm here, sweetheart. I adjusted his pillow and held him carefully against me. The fever didn't matter to me anymore. Neither did Lisa's warnings. I knew I needed to be careful, but watching Adrian struggle alone was something I simply couldn't do. So I stayed beside him. I gave him water. I helped him take his medicine. I held him whenever the fever made him restless. And every time he opened his eyes, I reminded him that I was there. Eventually, Adrian wrapped his arms around me. His body trembled. And then he started crying. Ethan. I'm here. He held me tighter. Don't leave. I won't. That night, I stayed beside him until his fever finally began to come down. He eventually fell asleep with his head against my chest. I watched him quietly. And I realized something. I didn't care if I had to cancel every meeting, postpone every business trip, or spend every night beside him. He was my husband. And taking care of him wasn't a burden. It was something I wanted to do. A few weeks later, our lives changed again. We found out Adrian was pregnant. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Adrian looked at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Ethan. I could barely believe it myself. We're having a baby. His eyes filled with tears. I pulled him into my arms. My parents were overjoyed when we told them. The entire house seemed to celebrate with us. But I couldn't stop looking at Adrian. He kept resting his hand over his stomach with the sweetest smile. And I couldn't resist. I knelt in front of him and gently kissed his stomach. Adrian immediately turned red. Ethan. I kissed it again. What? You've done that 10 times. Then I'll make it 11. He laughed. I wrapped my arms around his waist and rested my cheek against his stomach. Hello, little one. Adrian ran his fingers through my hair. I already love them. Then I looked up at him. Just like I love you. His cheeks turned even redder. I love you too. And I kissed his belly once more. For so long, Adrian had lived believing his life would always belong to someone else. Now he was carrying our child. A child we had chosen together. A family we were building together. And when I looked at the smile on his face, I knew that every difficult day had been worth getting to this moment. 7 months into Adrian's pregnancy, I still couldn't believe how quickly our lives had changed. Sometimes I'd sit beside him without saying anything, simply resting my hand over his swollen belly and feeling our twins move beneath my palm. A boy and a girl. Our children. Did you feel that? Adrian asked one evening, smiling. I nodded. They're definitely going to be trouble. He laughed. That's probably because they have you as their father. I leaned over and kissed his belly. Then they'll be perfect. Adrian rolled his eyes, but I could see the smile he was trying to hide. Pregnancy had changed him. Not just physically. There was something different about him now. A confidence. A warmth. A happiness that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. And somehow, he looked more beautiful every single day. The next morning was his 29th birthday. While we were having breakfast, Adrian suddenly looked at me with a thoughtful expression. Ethan? Do you think I'm old? I nearly laughed. Old? I'm turning 29. I looked at him for a moment before leaning over and kissing him. You're not old. He smiled. You don't have to say that just because you love me. I'm not. I kissed his forehead. You look younger than half the 20-year-olds I know. He laughed. You really think so? I know so. And I meant it. There was something almost unreal about his glow. His face seemed brighter. His eyes were softer. And whenever he smiled, I found myself falling for him all over again. A few weeks later, our twins decided they had waited long enough. Our son arrived first. Our daughter followed shortly after. 2 tiny lives that had already changed everything. I remember holding them for the first time and feeling completely overwhelmed. But when I looked at Adrian, I forgot everything else. He was exhausted, emotional, and still somehow smiling. I walked over and kissed his forehead. "You did so well." He smiled weakly. "We did." And he was right. We had. When the day finally came to bring Adrian and the twins home, I had the entire estate decorated with flowers. Flowers in the entrance. Flowers along the halls. Flowers around the nursery. I wanted Adrian to come home to something beautiful. But more than anything, I wanted him to understand that this was where we would raise our kids, our home. Not somewhere he had been taken. Not somewhere he belonged because someone else had decided it. A home he had chosen. A family he had chosen. That night, once the twins were asleep, I found Adrian sitting quietly beside their cribs. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist. He leaned back against me. I kissed his temple. Then his cheek. Then his lips. "Thank you," I whispered. He turned toward me. "For what?" I smiled. "For giving me my family." His expression immediately changed. His eyes filled with tears. "Ethan." I gently cupped his face. "I dreamed about having a family like this." I swallowed. "But I never imagined I'd get one with someone like you." Adrian suddenly wrapped his arms around me. His tears soaked into my shirt. "You are my everything," he whispered. "You gave me all of this." He held me tighter. "You saved me." His voice broke. "You loved me when I didn't even believe I was worth loving." I hugged him close. "I'll always love you." He pulled back and looked at me through his tears. "You don't know how much I love you." A shaky smile appeared on his face. "But I promise I'll never disappoint you." I immediately shook my head. "You could never disappoint me." He tried to speak, but I gently touched his cheek. "You don't have to spend the rest of your life trying to prove that you're worthy of me." I kissed his forehead. "You already are." He closed his eyes. I looked toward the nursery. "Our children are going to grow up surrounded by love." Then I looked back at him. "And we're going to give them the kind of family neither of us ever wants to lose." Adrian nodded through his tears. Then he wrapped his arms around me again and rested his head against my chest. I held him tightly. For years, Adrian had believed his life would always belong to someone else. Tonight, standing beside him with our children sleeping peacefully nearby, I realized how far we had come. The man who had once been treated like someone's possession was now standing in a home that belonged to him. The Omega who once believed he could never be loved was now loved more deeply than he could ever imagine. And the man I had once promised to protect had become the person who had given me everything I'd never known I needed. I kissed the top of his head. "I love you, Adrian." He smiled against my chest. "I love you too." And as we stood there together, listening to the quiet sounds of our babies sleeping nearby, I knew this was only the beginning. We had spent years surviving the past. Now, we finally had a lifetime to live.